So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled 20th Century Fiction, where we're looking at Virginia Woolf's novel Mrs. Dalloway. So we'll just carry on where we left from where we left last time, and we looked at the whole embodiment of Septimus Smith, the war veteran who comes back from the battlefields and who's obviously traumatized and who feels medically, biologically and existentially alienated from everything around him. And we're looking at the alienation and the cognitive implications, the cognitive associations along with this alienation, and how it doesn't seem to connect to everything around him or anything around him. So he essentially becomes like a sheath, an insular sheath, completely insulated from any human connect. Now, the passage, the scene which we will do now, today, in this particular class is interesting because we'll look at a certain episode which takes place, in the sense of a certain action, a certain activity is taking place, and we look at Septimus's cognitive response to it. How does he respond to it? Or how does he not respond to it, more specifically? So the scene at play, the scene in question is a skywriting airplane. So this is a time where skywriting advertisements were becoming big in London. So we have this airplane, this advertising airplane, which is trying to advertise for a toffee. You know, it could be any kind of toffee name. So each letter will be sent up spiraled in a cloud. So all these spiral clouds will form a letter, and then together they'll form a name, a word on the sky, which will obviously be the brand name for that particular company. And what that would obviously do is that will make it hyper visible. So everyone in London, everyone in that part of London would get to see it, right? So the visibility quotient could be quite high. Now, the skywriting aeroplane was obviously, there was a sense of wonder, a sense of excitement about it because of the velocity, because of the visuality, etc. Now, the reason why Septimus is so unnerved, Septimus feels so completely detached from it, and also any attachment is a traumatic attachment with that particular activity, is because presumably the skywriting airplane reminds him of a plane about to bomb, right? So again, we have this entire continuation of the war violence into the civilian metropolis now, and he seems to be unable to move on. He seems to be unable to have moved on. So he remains, to a large extent, as an interrupted subject, a subject whose embodiment is interrupted by the trauma he experienced in the war fields. Right? So this particular section is important, and because it just dramatizes so spectacularly the different cognitive response embodied by Septimus in relation to the other people's responses, everyone else around them, as is consuming the entire episode in a very visual way. It's like a happy entertainment for them, whereas for Septimus it's a very gruesome and grotesque reminder of the bombing planes which he had presumably seen at the war trenches. It's just come out from the war. Okay, so this is Lucretia, Septimus's wife, trying to draw his attention to the skywriting aeroplane, and this should be on the screen. Look, look, Septimus, she cried, for Dr. Holmes had told her to make a husband who had nothing whatever seriously the matter with him, but was a little out of sorts, taking an interest in things outside himself. Now, this one sentence tells a lot, because Dr. Holmes and Bradshaw, these are two doctors mentioned in this particular novel, and they obviously represent and embody heavy masculinist medicine. Medicine which is determined and largely governed by a very, very male sense of logic and rationality. And anything which does not come within that purview, within that radar of rationality, would be considered to be effeminate, would be considered to be hysterical, would be considered to be completely inappropriate. So it was decided by Dr. Holmes that Septimus had nothing wrong with him, seriously, right? So he had nothing whatever seriously the matter with him, but was a little out of sorts. He was just a little out of sorts, according to Dr. Holmes, right? And this being out of sorts is important over here, because that obviously underlines the fact that he was a misfit, medical misfit in the eyes of this very, very masculinist medicine, right? So, and he had been instructed by Dr. Holmes, he's been instructed and advised by Dr. Holmes to take an interest in things outside himself. So again, this whole idea of looking at the shell-shocked soldier as a traumatized war veteran, as someone who's over-introspective, someone who is constantly absorbed and obsessed with his own self, is something which was seen as unmanly. So the unmanliness of Septimus is something which is which is equated according to this medical practitioners, with his insanity or irrationality, right? So the fact that it's irrational is equated with his unmanliness, because rationality is equated with manliness in a very, very mathematical way, right? So those crude equations is something which informs contemporary medicine, and a medicine that Septimus is subjected to, the medical science that he is subjected to. So in that sense, this novel, Mrs. Dalloway, becomes a very interesting reflection, a very complex and dark reflection of the tyranny of medicine, the tyranny of biomedicine, and how there was meted out to the shell-shocked soldiers, how they became the very, very unwilling subjects of that tyranny of medicine. So Septimus obviously becomes someone who becomes a victim, not just to his disease, but also, and more importantly, to the treatment given to his disease, right? And the treatment is something which victimizes him, which shames him publicly, socially, existentially, and of course medically. Right, so that sense of being shamed, that sense of being told over and over again that you are unmanly, you're over-introspective, you have this narcissistic introspection, which is what the problem is. There's nothing else which is bothering you. You don't really have any real disease. So the unreality of shell shock is something which was a big deal in London and England at that point of time. It wasn't really classified as a proper malady. It was just some kind of a mental aberration, something which came from over-introspection, something which came from, according to this medical science practitioners, something which came because of the emotional nature, the morbidly narcissistic emotional nature of these people. All that was very, very unmanly, all that was very, very problematically proximate to hysteria, which is obviously the female malady, something which came from the womb. So Lucretia Warren Smith, she had been told by the doctors of Septimus that nothing really is wrong with him, and he should take some interest in things outside of himself, right? So this whole idea of over-introspection is something which is condemned by contemporary medicine. Okay, so thought Septimus, looking up, they are signaling to me, not indeed in actual words, that is, he could not read the language yet, but it was plain enough, this beauty, this exquisite beauty, and tears filled his eyes as he looked at the smoke wars languishing and melting in the sky, and bestowing upon him in an inexhaustible charity and laughing goodness one shape after another of unimaginable beauty, and signaling the intention to provide him for nothing, forever, for looking merely, with beauty, more beauty. Tears ran down his cheeks. So again, this is obviously the right kind of response, notionally the right response to an advertisement for toffee. He feels the whole scene to be very, very sublime, and this sublimity, almost grips him with its beauty, and that obviously makes him teary. He begins to almost cry. Tears ran down his cheeks. So again, the whole idea of crying, this man crying in a very public place in London, that will be equated by people like Holmes and Bradshaw as very, very unmanly. So the unmanliness of Septimus's response is important over here, because that's exactly what is condemned by the doctors, by the medical practitioners, such as Holmes and Bradshaw. It was toffee. They were advertising toffee. A nursemaid told Razia. Together they began to spell T-O-F, right? So in other words, the letters are coming one after the other, and together form one word, T-O-F, toffee, and maybe they'll have a name as well. And that's the whole point of the advertisement, to make it hyper-visible and very, very public. K-R, said the nursemaid, and Septimus heard her say K-R close to his ear. Deeply, softly, like a mellow organ, but with a roughness in her voice like a grasshopper's, which rasped the spine deliciously and sent running up into his brain waves of sound, which, concussing, broke. So again, look at the deceleration of cognitive response over here. Everything seems to be slowing down for Septimus. So KR, he hears it as KR, it's so decelerated, it's slowed down, it's become more loud perhaps. And that's obviously because of his very disturbed cognitive and spinal system, nervous system, which has been almost permanently destroyed by the war. And Wolff seems to be offering a very, very graphic description of cognitive absorption and cognitive perception over here. And we are told that, he hears the voice of the nursemaid as that of a grasshopper, which rasped his spine deliciously and sent running up into his brain waves of sound, which, concussing, broke. So the waves of sound came running up to his brain, through his spine, and then the concussions began to be formed, and then they broke. And the whole idea, the whole activity over here is listen to a particular word which is being advertised in the sky, and how that is responded and received by the traumatized war veteran is what this whole episode is all about, right? So he's begun to get concussions and the spines are delicious, sending out sound waves to his brain, and the brain is receiving the sound waves as concussions, and the sound waves are then breaking in his brain, and that becomes a very graphic image, a very decelerated graphic image. Excuse me. A marvelous discovery indeed that a human voice in a certain atmospheric condition, one must be scientific, above all scientific. So again, the word scientific comes twice. One must be scientific, above all scientific. It's obviously a critique, it's a jibe against the hyper-rationality of science. So a discovery has been made apparently that a human voice in certain atmospheric conditions can quicken trees into life. So trees can be brought to life, trees can be quickened into life, they can grow quicker. If it is spoken to in a human voice in certain atmospheric conditions. Okay. Happily, Razia put her hand with a tremendous weight on his knee so that he was weighed down, transfixed. Or the excitement of the elm trees rising and falling with all the leaves alight and a color thinning and thickening from blue to the green to the hollow wave, like plumes on horses' heads, feathers on ladies. So proudly they rose and fell. So superbly would have sent him mad, but he would not go mad. He would shut his eyes, he would say no more. So there seems to be an excess of senses over here, an excess of sensation and excitement, all because of something very, very banal. This whole idea of the skywriting airplane advertising for toffee is something which is a very urban thing, it's something which people see every day. But to Septimus, this becomes such an excitement, such an exciting event that it can't take it anymore. It's almost like there's a complete explosion of senses inside his body. His brain is receiving concussions because of the sound waves, and he would shut his eyes now. He would say no more. He's completely shutting himself down because of the explosion, of the sense explosion around him, and that's something which obviously can be attributed to his damaged nervous system, to his damaged cognitive system. So everything appears to him in a different register, in a different cognitive register, compared to the quote-unquote normal people around him, the normal civilians around him. Okay. But the beckoned, leaves were alive, trees were alive, and the leaves being connected to by millions of fibers with his own body, there on the seat, fanned it open down. When the brains stretched, he too made the statement. The sparrows fluttering, rising and falling in jack fountains were part of the pattern. The white and blue, barred with black branches. Sound made harmonies with premeditation. The spaces between them were as significant as the sounds. A child cried. Rightly far away, a horn sounded. All taken together meant the birth of a new religion. Now, obviously, this is classic stream of consciousness technique that Wolf is using over here. And all these sounds seem to be blending together in Septimus's cognitive system, in Septimus's nervous system. And the blend of the sounds is interesting because that is beginning to form something like a new religion to him. Now, what does religion signify? Religion is obviously a faith system. Religion is something that he can cognitively attach to. So the only religion that Septimus is sort of attaching himself to is this blend, this bricolage of sounds. So everything is coming together in this very urban setting. And that is producing not just an explosion of senses, but also an epiphany in his brain. An epiphany, again, as I may have mentioned already several times, we're looking at Eliot's early poetry and also the short story by Joyce. Epiphany over here is a neural mechanism. It's something which happens to you neurally. It's like a special electrochemical reaction in the brain where you get this light bulb moment. But also epiphany can extend into something more existential, something more elevating. So, and in some cases, for instance, in Joseph Conrad's writing, epiphany can also be a dark knowledge, a dark negative enlightenment, a negative narrative of knowledge. Right? So obviously, if you take a look at how the word religion appears, something which is presumably and notionally mystic, appears over here through a different combination of different machinic sounds. So the car horns shrieking somewhere, a child crying somewhere, and obviously this skywriting airplane whirring around in the sky and producing different kinds of images and waves in the sky all come together, and then we have these leaves and the trees and the branches swirling in this London air. They all come together to produce an alchemy of sensations, and that alchemy is what religion is all about. All taken together meant the birth of a new religion. Septimus, said Razia, he started violently. People must notice. So again, the very violent response to his own name, is something which obviously shows that he's a nervous wreck, someone who cannot control the nervous system anymore, someone who's actually neurally very, very challenged, very, very compromised, very, very different from the normative order. Okay, I'm going to walk to the fountain and back, she said, for she could stand it no longer. Now, this is a passage which is interesting because you also get a glimpse of Razia's own alienation over here. Because first of all, we're told she's an Italian. So obviously she's a cultural, political and linguistic outsider in this London metropolis. So she's someone who met during the war and they got married. But now in London, she feels completely alienated, not least because her husband, who's from London, who's an Englishman, is completely broken the level of reception, the level of cognitive response and cognitive unity. So Septimus is a cognitive anarchy. It becomes a completely traumatized subject and almost traumatic-philic. He loves absorbing the trauma that is still live in him and his body through his experiences from the war. So that obviously accentuates the alienation faced by Razia, and she needs a break now. She thinks of going away for a while to spend some time with herself. For she couldn't stand it no longer. Dr. Holmes might say there was nothing the matter. So again, there's a jibe at this medical, masculinist medicine where Dr. Holmes is completely convinced there's nothing the matter with Septimus. There's no serious matter that Septimus is experiencing or suffering. For rather would she that he were dead. She could not sit beside him when he stayed and did not see her, and made everything terrible. Sky and tree, children playing, dragging carts, blowing whistles, falling down, all were terrible. So contrast the very terrible experience of Razia with the supposed sublimity that Septimus is facing, Septimus is experiencing over here, right? So, it's very clearly told to us that Razia is not quite convinced with Dr. Holmes's diagnosis of the situation. She's thinking that Dr. Holmes might say there was nothing the matter, but for her, everything was terrible. All the sounds around, all the sights around, all the images around, they all become one terrible combination of different things. All were terrible, and he would not kill himself, and she could tell no one. Septimus has been working too hard. That was all she could say to her own mother. So, there's no rationale, according to her, for Septimus's behavior, and in some sense, she sometimes wishes that he killed himself, he committed suicide, because he could never put down Septimus's behavior to any particular rationale, to any particular reason. And the only thing that she can say, only thing that she could say to her mother, was that Septimus is working too hard. That was all that she could say to her own mother. To love one makes solitary, she thought. She could tell nobody, not even Septimus now, and looking back, she saw him sitting in his shabby overcoat alone, on the seat, hunched up, staring. So that image of Septimus in an overcoat, cut off from everyone else, cut off from this very busy London, sitting there hunched up, staring at nothingness, staring at blankness, and that becomes an embodiment of modernist alienation, especially in the case of Septimus, alienation is quite medical in quality because he's a war veteran who's just come back from the war. So he just becomes this immobile subject, interrupted subject, sitting on the bench and staring, hunched up and staring. And it was cowardly for a man to say he would kill himself, but Septimus had fought. He was brave. He was not Septimus now. So again, the whole idea of masculinity is interesting because we are also told Septimus had been brave at one point in time. He had killed at one point in time. He had fought a war at some point in time. But now, he's saying cowardly things such as he would kill himself. And that's an act of cowardice according to the medical practitioners, according to religious people. And that cowardice of Septimus is something which is contrasted with his masculinity which he exhibited during the war. Right, so according to Razia, all this becomes a very complicated transition from a position of cowardice to a position of privilege to a position of cowardice. That is the transition Septimus makes. Okay, so he was on Septimus now. So again, the whole idea of he is not himself anymore is a very neural thing. It's a very cognitive thing. He seems to be more blank. He seems to have suffered an injury, and there are many instances where people, who experience, let's say, blunt trauma or a traumatic disorder or any sense of shock, any emotional anxiety, to be changed permanently in the level of behavior, the level of reception, to such an extent that people who are very, very close to them would say they're not themselves anymore. So what happens when you say that someone is not themselves anymore? That obviously means that there's been some neural, cerebral, existential and emotional change which has had a complete makeover from the person's formal, neural and cognitive frame that has changed forever. Okay, so So he was on himself now. She put on a lace collar, she put on a new hat, and he never noticed. And he was happy without her. Nothing could make her happy without him. Nothing. He was selfish. So men are. For he was not ill. Dr. Holmes said there was nothing the matter with him. So this is the third time we've been told that she thinks, she's just repeating in her mind what Dr. Holmes had said to her, nothing is the matter with your husband. And obviously that is part of the jibe against masculinist medicine, because we clearly see that Septimus is suffering from a nervous disorder, from an existential alienation. But the medical science at that time cannot comprehend it, cannot gauge it, cannot calibrate it. And because they could not calibrate it, quantify it. So we see this complete dichotomy, this complete incompatibility, this complete non-understanding between the medical science, the medical people, and the sufferers over here. All right? And I think I'll give you a background to this as well. This is a time where British psychiatry was found completely wanting in terms of understanding, in terms of engaging with trauma victims. And this is also a time where Freud and psychoanalysis became very important, because the whole idea of making sufferers tell their stories, making sufferers tell their dreams became very, very important at that time. So Freud and psychoanalysis, although is not really considered universally scientific today, it was very helpful at that time, because the whole activity of converting a trauma into a story, into a narrative which could be told, the whole idea of converting a dream into a story which could be told, is something which Freud propagated and practiced at that point of time. Okay, so the entire incompatibility between the sufferers and the practitioners is something which has been dramatized over here. And obviously Razia's alienation is even more because of a political and cultural and national identity as an Italian in London post First World War. So I'll just stop at this point, and the last bit is interesting because, again, it is mentioned that Dr. Holmes said there's nothing the matter with him. So if Dr. Holmes decides it's nothing the matter, then obviously nothing's the matter. She spread her hand before her. Look, her wedding ring slipped. She had grown so thin. It is she who suffered, but she had nobody to tell. So again, the alienation of Razia is absolute over here, and it's sort of very tempting to look at Septimus Smith as the only sufferer, the only male sufferer in London at that point of time. But Razia's suffering is obviously medical as well as existential, because she sees her husband suffer in front of her. At the same time, she's suffering because of existential and political alienation. And the slipping off of the wedding ring becomes obviously very symbolic. Her fingers had grown so thin, she had grown so thin that a wedding ring is slipping off, which is very symbolic of the fact that a marriage is now very, very fragile. A marital relationship is very, very fragile. So this becomes a very symbolic reflection of her fragility. And we are told that it is she who suffered. It was she who suffered the most, but she had nobody to tell, right? So the whole idea of being cut off from everyone around is something which is suffered by Razia. And we are also told far was Italy and her white houses and a room where her sisters sat making hats, and the streets crowded every evening when people walking, laughing out loud, not half alive like people here, huddled up in bath chairs, looking at a few ugly flowers stuck in pots. So this image of this very abundant, fertile, vibrant Italy compared to this very pale and almost anemic London is something which Razia conjures in her mind, and that obviously accentuates the alienation as an Italian woman in a post-war London, with a very, very medically ill husband who doesn't have any connection to the world around him. So that entire experience completely alienates existentially as well as politically, and she feels someone who is completely cut off, and she's the one who suffers, but she has nobody to tell. And she can only conjure this abundant image, or the image of abundance in Italy, and contrast that with the paleness of London that is the present time that she is experiencing and inhabiting. So I stop at this point today, and we'll continue with this novel in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.